Well, so this is the one that people remember.
Oh
This is
man.
this is the one. If the people who like the Books of Blood, if you ask them, if you just got them all together in a room, everyone who's ever read it and said, okay, all of you, right now, just randomly, the first story that comes into your head from the Books of Blood, this is the one.
It's
This is the one.
so fucking so okay. So first thing that I wanted to say about this is up until the last sort of 3 or 4 pages where things get like fucking insane.
Right.
This is, I know it's a short story, but
Hmm.
this is hands down one of the best horror movies I've ever seen.
Yeah. Right.
Like hands down one of the best horror movies I've ever. This is intensely cinematic.
Isn't it just? I know there has been a film adaptation, and the less said about the film adaptation, the better, quite frankly. But you question why it hasn't been done
Yeah,
correctly, right?
yeah.
Because it's like the best script you've ever read, right? This
It's so good.
this this could be one of the most fascinating horror films ever made.
It's really intriguing. I mean, the only thing I would question in terms of a movie's length, I think it would be,
Yeah.
it might be the greatest short horror film. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
because I think really it's like I mean, this is like this. You know what this would be like if the Outer Limits was a horror series,
Right.
or like the
Right.
Twilight Zone was out and out horror. This would be the one.
Oh,
This would be the half hour of legend, right? This would
yeah.
be the one that would generate 1 million complaints and
Yeah, it's the one that people would remember for generations to
yeah,
come. They'd be telling
yeah,
their kids about,
yeah,
it would be that thing, right?
yeah,
And you're right, it is so cinematic.
yeah,
From like it's all visual.
yeah,
Like almost every element of it is visual, from the way it describes New York. I mean, from the perspective of Leon Kaufman,
yep.
the one of the protagonists,
Well, there we
because
go.
Barker does that thing again in
Yeah,
this story of like dancing around the place, like switching from narrator to narrator, from narrator to narrator. I mean, in this story, as opposed to the way it does it in the Book of Blood. In the Book of Blood, I'd say it's slightly more fey. It's slightly more, I don't know, it feels more like a dance in the Book of Blood. Like he's doing it in a slightly less deliberate manner, as he
I
is here. Here it's a
yeah.
device, right? Here he's drawing these two characters together along their seem ostensibly unrelated paths and journeys, and the ideologies that they have, and the ways they view the world. He's drawing them slowly together. There's like
Yeah,
a slightly almost like Wildian element to it, in the sense that it's like a theater of absurdities, right? These two
yeah.
come together by complete coincidence. Like there's nothing moving them that brings them together. They
Well,
just come together by complete coincidence.
or do they, or is it
Or do they?
or do they?
Mhm.
Because you can make a case, right, that this is the the energy and the metaphysics of the city itself that
Yes,
pulls
it's the
them towards each
engine.
other.
Right.
That there's a kind of fatalism, because let's not forget, I mean, not but the reason that they end up in the same place is because the cops arrest the wrong guy.
Yeah, right. That's a
That's
fair point, actually. That is a fair point. And of course, I mean, we're jumping ahead a little bit here,
mm,
but there is a purpose to their meeting, even though it
mm,
seems arbitrary and even though it's fraught. There is like a wider implied, again, I'm going to use that word, implied metaphysics
yeah,
to their
no,
meeting.
absolutely. There's a
And
there's a fatalism to it. There's a fatalism to it. And whether it's what's brilliant about it, because it's Barker, and where Barker is such a
mhm,
brilliant writer, is the fatalism itself is almost like a Rorschach fatalism.
yeah,
You can read the story as chance if you want. You can read it as fate if you want, and it
mhm,
works perfectly
yeah, totally.
with either
Because
reading.
there's not a god in this story per se, or if there is a god, it's the city, right? It's New
Yeah.
York itself. It's a moribund god.
Well,
It
again, also
paints
it's not a god, all
No,
right? It's a
no.
I don't know what it is.
If it
It's a
is a god,
monster. It's
it's
a demon.
yeah.
It's
I
yeah,
mean, I think he even describes it this way himself. If it is a god, it's like a syphilitic, worm-eaten, dead thing, right? It's
well,
it's not. worth
It's
consideration.
Father of Fathers is the name it's given.
Yeah, right.
And it's a giant mound of flesh. I mean, it's all tentacles and teeth
Mhm.
and dripping and
The
yeah,
way he,
putrescence.
I
It's
mean, the way he actually describes New York itself in the opening
yes.
segments, where he describes it as like, I mean, Kaufman has this, you get an immediate, very quick backstory for Kaufman, and it just tells you everything you need to know about the guy. It's really wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he was a young man. He was defeated by his own dreams, right? He had this idealized view of New York, came to New York and realized that it wasn't this utopia. It wasn't the city the gleaming city on the hill that he had in his mind's eye.
Oh, but you got to hit the imagery because it's so important.
Yeah,
Fell in love with New York as a beautiful
as a
woman, and
woman,
then he
right?
discovered New York was actually like a kind of murderer's whore,
Yeah,
you know?
I
And
mean,
it's like, come on.
it's awesome, right? I mean, like he had seen her wake in the morning like a slut and pick murdered men from between her teeth and
Ah,
suicides from the
it's so
tangles
great.
of her hair.
And here's the thing as well, like Barker manages to use that language, and yet it doesn't. I mean, I'd be interested to see what get a woman's reader's
Mm.
perspective on it. It doesn't come off misogynistic to me at all. It's
No,
really
I mean,
interesting.
it's not Barker's own assessment. That's the thing.
Yeah,
It's not his assessment. It's like he's regarding this from the perspective of a 1980s heterosexual man, right?
it's so interesting.
Who's
But yeah,
really out of love with
yeah,
his place, not only with the city, but with it's not just the city. New York's kind of a microcosm. It's humanity, isn't it? He
yeah,
is out of love with his life. And in that regard, he's manifesting something again essential to the spirit of the 1980s, which is this escalating isolation, inhumanity, our separation from one another. Because that's another thing that you get in this story, right? It's
yeah.
set in New York. So it's this bustling hive of humanity, and yet both characters are, even when they are amongst humanity, are completely isolated from it.
Well, it's what I love about it is that it's that, and this is again, you're right. This is a theme that runs through a lot of 80s fiction, and again, an absolute ton of 80s cinema, which is why it resonates in that way. It's a sense of profound alienation, but also profound alienation in a place in which you are constantly cheek by jowl
Yeah,
with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. You know, that's
yeah.
the thing. That's the horror of it. It's the hell of other people and yet being alone,
Well,
right?
that's the irony, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
in just the first 2 pages, you get this horrific statement upon society, upon 1980s culture, 1980s Western culture.
Mm.
Barker clearly regards it as an inhumane condition, right? Which
Yep.
just accepts things like murders, violence, rapes, suicides as just part and parcel. That is part of the engine. And what he's very cleverly doing is kind of commenting upon systemic violence, right? And the
Yep.
allowance of atrocity. Because you compare and contrast with the murders that occur later, which are incredibly graphic and horrific,
Mhm.
they're no more horrific than what is part and parcel of day-to-day life.
Yeah.
That's that's part of the story, isn't it? That is part of the themes of the story. Again, I mean, I made this comment in the books when we talked about the Book of Blood, but something reviewers of certainly of the era constantly missed, certainly about this story, is they focused exclusively upon the graphic imagery, almost
Mm.
exclusively upon the graphic imagery, and they missed these wonderful juxtapositions and dichotomies that he draws. Where, I mean, and this is one of the rare times where Barker is getting political, right? He's getting
Oh yeah.
deliberately and
100%.
fairly overtly political. I mean, all of his work has political dimension, obviously,
Yeah.
but he tends to eschew in his older, later on, he tends to eschew direct political commentary in favor of metaphysics and so on and so forth. Here, he's going for the throat.
Oh
He
yeah.
is expressing this profound dissatisfaction with the state of humanity, with the state of our cultures, the state of our systems. He is basically saying they're sick. They're sick. He perceives from within the belly of the beast a diseased entity and phenomena.
And what's fascinating about that to me is that it shares. I mean, one of the reasons it's cinematic is it shares so much. You know that those themes play throughout an awful lot of 80s cinema, and you think about I mean, the movies I thought about were Taxi Driver, which of course is New York. I mean, that's early 80s,
Right.
but I think it is 1980 is Taxi Driver, I think. So I think it is an 80s movie. And that obviously that's all about these same themes, right? That sense of alienation from,
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, Travis Bickle is arguably both of the protagonists of Meat
Yes.
Train, right? He's actually on
Yeah.
both sides of that. He's almost like, almost like a combination of the two characters. But it's got kind of that vibe. There's also, though, because you get the perspective switch to the killer, to Mahogany, right?
That's right.
You've got like that. To me, was very reminiscent of Dirty Harry. Now I know Dirty Harry's San Francisco rather than New York, but there's that same kind of sense of like, because Dirty Harry, the whole thing about that is this kind of out of control criminal element and this kind of increasing, like, more and more psychopaths are somehow being generated and born, and law enforcement. I mean, it's very, very, very reactionary, very right wing
Yes.
to work in a lot of ways. This isn't, but the commonality is that switching between, the point of view characters and going at the killer. The other cinematic thing that I thought about, which obviously, could well have been influenced by Meat Train because it's a whole generation later, but this reminded me of Seven so much.
Right.
It felt so reminiscent of Seven.
Like tonally, if nothing else,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
It's
yeah,
got
yeah.
that patina, and it's a very difficult thing to express, and certainly a difficult thing to create in any form of fiction. But that patina of dirt,
Yeah,
where
grime.
it
Yeah.
feels dirty, like to experience it leaves you with a feeling as though you've been soiled.
Yeah.
That's a very difficult thing to do, but that is something certainly. I mean, you find that throughout the Books of Blood. You certainly find it in Seven, and it's exemplified, I think, in this story. And I think it is simply because the environment itself is so tainted, right?
You know what? The key to that, because I completely agree with you. For me, the key to that, the way Barker manages to communicate all of that in a single scene, it's the character he bumps into, literally bumps into in the coffee
Yeah,
shop.
yeah.
It's such a vivid scene, and it's great because that guy doesn't come back. He's just
No,
there for that scene, and it's almost a red herring, right? Because you could almost think like, well, what was that about?
ooh,
And
is that
which
is
is
that the
fine.
killer? Ooh, maybe he'll come back later. In a lesser story, that was what would happen, isn't it?
But
That'd be the twist, right?
But just think about that guy, the way he's described, the way he's perceived by a main character in that
Yeah,
moment, by a narrator in that moment, or a
yeah.
point of view character. The missing teeth, and
The almost like the addled frame of mind where he just
yeah,
starts spouting about conspiracy theories and so on and so to a complete stranger, right? Whose coffee
yeah,
is spilt, by the way. So
yeah,
he's
yeah,
already
yeah,
preyed upon the guy's time. But this is really, it is kind of cynical, isn't it? This is
yeah.
Barker's portrait of normal humanity in these systems, right?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? It's like the way because I think he describes him as something like the kind of, this is the kind of boorish isn't the right word I can't remember the word he used, but this is the kind of
Here we
arrogant,
go. He says
unpleasant,
he hated that kind of man, the opinionated brute that New York bred so well.
opinionated brute.
He would
Perfect.
use that
Yeah.
exact turn of phrase again later in Sacrament, and he swaps
Oh,
it
okay.
for Britain.
Oh, that's
He
fascinating.
swaps it
Yeah,
for
that's fascinating.
England, right?
Well, I mean, fair play. You know a good
Yeah,
line when you read one. You know what I
absolutely.
mean?
I mean, it's awesome. It's a
It doesn't.
great.
It's not plagiarism if you're copying yourself.
No,
That's
no, it's an astute
oh, it's
observation
good.
as well.
Yeah,
It's a generational commentary, that's for damn sure, because
yeah, of
Barker
course
would
it
have been
is.
amongst the younger generations at this time.
Yeah,
It's a class commentary
yeah.
because Barker, he wasn't living in New York at the time, he was living in London, but same difference, right?
No, I mean absolutely, and that's something I did want to mention actually, because New York, because I've been to New York a couple of times. I've been to Manhattan a couple of times, and certainly Manhattan. I can't speak for the rest of the city, but Manhattan and central London, that
Yeah.
they are two cities. They are two areas of cities that are absolutely convinced to their core that they are the center of the fucking
Of the whole
universe.
fucking universe. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and when you walk around there a little bit, you kind of understands why they think that. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like,
yeah.
agree or disagree, but you look around and think, yeah, okay,
Mhm.
I get why you like this. I
I mean,
get why you like
that's
this New York. I get why you like this London.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the reason for the setting, is it? Because this could have been
yeah,
set in
yeah,
London, right? And
yeah.
then Barker would have had more familiarity because that's where he lived at the time. But the reason he sets it in New York is because he's looking at New York is a microcosm, right? It's kind of a metaphor for society and indeed for urban society, urban
Yeah,
centers that have a patina about them, that have a romanticism about them. He's like, oh, fuck that. No,
yeah.
it's you are wrong to romanticize the not only urban environments but the systems that they represent.
I think that's right, but I do also think it's because he's tapping into the energy of particularly of Manhattan and Central New York in that era, because it
Yeah.
is like it is unrecognizable now. And I don't want to kind of, I don't want to wax nostalgic for an era I never knew, but
Mhm.
it is a fact that Times Square in the 80s and Times Square in the noughties and on are unrecognizable to each
Yeah.
other. They are different environments, and I'm not nostalgic for 80s Times Square because I was never there, and I'm sure it was, if you did live there, actually, there were probably downsides to having that level of crime and the
Yeah,
stuff that was
right.
going. Like, I'm not like whatever, and I'm not. It's so far outside of my fucking lane. It's a completely different highway in a completely different country, literally. So I'm
Mhm.
not going to comment on that. But it is a fact that it changed. And
Yeah.
when Barker's writing in the 80s, that area of New York, it did have a reputation, but it was kind of a deserved reputation. It was a very, very kind of, well, it was interesting because it was, in some ways it was bohemian, but it was undeniably sleazy as well. It was
Yeah, right.
undeniably kind of, and of course for Barker, when you think about his background both as a working class guy but also as a working class gay man who's had to live under the
Right.
radar, that kind of environment is simultaneously threatening and attractive.
Right. It's where he operated too. I
Of
mean, like
course,
let's not.
out of necessity it would have been
Yeah.
where he operates. So so
That's the culture he was immersed in. I mean, as I say, he lived in a squat. He had
sure.
no money. He lived in the center of London.
So when
Um,
he uses his our first point of view character and he talks about falling in love and then falling out of love, seeing the beauty and then seeing the brutality.
Well, that echoes
You know,
Barker's experience. I mean, like
exactly.
he and his group of friends from school, who are all high, people like Doug Bradley and Pete Atkins,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
highly theatrical people. They all went down as a mass to London to pursue their creative careers. They had incredibly profound ideas about what they were going to do on the theatre circuit and whatnot. And although they did have creative success, they ended up kind of destitute,
sure,
and they
sure.
saw the real darkness of these
Yeah,
systems and of humanity, of the way of what these places and the systems of the era did to human
yeah.
beings.
But I also love how, I mean, what's canny about that though is that in this particular story, like Barker's character, the first guy we meet anyway, I mean, he's got a job, he's hanging
Yeah,
on.
Kaufman is
Yeah,
is
Kaufman's is
like, in
working
terms
and
of
he's
the expectations of the era, he was okay, right?
yeah, yeah,
He's stable. He's
yeah,
got a decent job in an office. He's financially stable. He's got a place to live. He's got food, like all the necessities of existence. But he is profoundly unsatisfied, like spiritually starving, right?
yeah, absolutely.
And then you've
Absolutely.
got him contrasted by Mahogany,
Yeah.
who is a very fascinating character, because whereas
Yeah.
Kaufman is completely disillusioned with the city and with any notion of romanticizing it, Mahogany, who by the way is our killer character, and the book makes no, it doesn't play any silly games. It's like right
No.
off the bat, it doesn't play
Yeah.
cat and mouse. It's like,
Yeah.
Mahogany, this is our killer character. This
Yeah.
is the guy, and it even does that wonderful mirroring thing where it sort of echoes Kaufman's day with Mahogany's, and
Yeah.
Mahogany has
Yeah.
business to be about too.
Yeah.
Mahogany's got work to do as well, and he's got preparations to make, and he's got domestic stuff to do. So he's got to brush his teeth, and he's got to get his clothes ready and whatnot. And Mahogany is still in love with the city. He's in love with a sincere romanticism and a sincere metaphysics that's operating beneath the surface.
Yeah. No, that's well, and literally,
Yeah, yeah,
literally and
literally beneath the
metaphorically beneath the
surface, right?
surface. No, it's so great. And what I love about it is, so you're absolutely right. He plays no games at all. Here's the psycho, and I love that
Yep,
because that, by the way, although this is a short story, this is a classic thriller structure at
yep.
this point. As soon as you switch point of view to the killer, you're creating a classic thriller structure where you have, I mean, normally the detective, the investigator, whatever, and the killer. In this
Mhm.
case, it's slightly more interesting because we know that Kaufman's none of those things. So,
No, he's
so,
none of those things, and he's
so,
only like, I mean, and
yeah,
one of the most interesting things about the way this book is structured, the way it introduces the notion of the murders. Kaufman's only sort of like heard of them because they're kind of ambient in the city. People are aware that there are murders happening on the subway, and they're quite gruesome,
yeah,
but he doesn't regard them in any greater way than he does like the aforementioned murders and suicides that just happen as a matter of course.
Right.
It's just one of those things that happens in this slut of a city, right?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because they almost serve as a, Kaufman almost sees them as a manifestation. Kaufman
Yeah.
almost sees them as a metaphor. I mean, they're not, they've really happened, but he sees them as just another symptom of
Yeah.
the disease that is the city, that is
Right.
living in the city. It's just, well, that's it. We are meat,
And
we
there's a
are fucking,
boredom of it, isn't there? Like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
he's grown inured to atrocity.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Which is, again, that's barely even a metaphor. I mean, it's really
Yeah.
smart stuff.
It's a
Um,
very stark commentary once again on this culture and this
yeah,
society, right? It's Barker himself talking through his characters, stepping back and saying, isn't this awful?
yeah,
Isn't this horrific that this systemic violence and this systemic atrocity is just what we allow? It's just what happens. It's part of our existence
yeah.
in these diseased engines. And that is awful.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, the other thing I love about that first glimpse with Mahogany, that first time when we are preaching. So again, we've established that it's a thriller structure, right? So it's
Mhm.
in this case not investigator but potential victim, or certainly we know as soon as we meet Mahogany, okay, so Kaufman's on a collision course with this guy,
Yeah,
because
it's
that's
going to
just
happen, right?
that's how narrative works, right? So we understand that what's being set up here is some kind of confrontation, and we're it's probably going to be on the subway. We've worked that much out as well
Of
because we know what's
course,
going
right?
on. But what I love about what it does is by delivering that, because it's a thriller structure and because it's New York and because we've already got these resonances with New York cinema and that kind of story, it allows Barker to do something very clever with Mahogany, which is have him hide in plain sight. And what I mean by that
Right.
is he's clearly a crazy psycho killer. So when he starts babbling on about the protection of the city elders,
Hmm.
this is my first read, bear in mind, I'm reading it going like, oh, okay, you're really crazy.
You are
And
properly
that's
crazy,
it.
right? He
You
talks about
believe that you're
being,
somehow protected by some, and that is so fucking smart, because what
isn't
he's
it, right?
doing, what Barker's doing there is he's leaning on a literary and cinematic tradition of the crazed
Hmm.
psychopath, and because it's New York, and because of everything else he's done, and because of the cinematic nature of the book, I'm just totally sucker punched by that. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so this is this guy's pathology,
Yes,
because
you think that he's
yeah,
mythologizing himself,
of
right? That
course,
he's
because
weaving himself into this imaginary delusion of like, oh,
yeah,
I'm part of the tradition of Jack the Ripper and Gilles
because
de
that's
Rais, right?
because that's already what cinema has taught us, that these kind of killers are. And obviously
Mhm.
that's an idea that will breach its kind of, arguably its apotheosis with like Red Dragon and
Of
Manhunter
course.
and Silence of the Lambs, that whole kind of, the books and the movies. But even in 84, that's become established. And
Yeah.
obviously, again, there's the ripples forward, right? We're back to Seven, because that's, Spacey's
Mhm.
character in Seven is divinely driven, right?
Yes. And also banal in the same way that mahogany is
Yes,
banal, right?
yes, yes, yes. No, that's actually, I'm so glad you said that. That's such an important point, because he is. I mean, like you said, that's the beauty at the end of Mahogany's first, chapter, whatever you want to call it, section. Is like, and now I have to go to work, like everyone
Yeah, and
else is
also
working
like
stiff.
I love the way Barker really takes pains to explore the real details of banality of this man. So he's getting a little bit old, isn't he,
Yeah,
Mahogany? And he's a
yeah,
little bit
yeah.
annoyed that he's got like grey chest hairs now, and he feels a bit creaky, and maybe
Well,
he
he
should
even
train
has
up.
that.
At.
That's that moment of speculation. Should I get an apprentice?
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I love that
No, I
so
do.
much because it takes away the mythology of him to a certain degree. It makes him more banal. It makes him more domestic and human, and in that regard, kind of petty.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great. But again, because of that, that wrong foots you as a reader, right? That makes you
Yeah,
think that all feeds into the narrative of, okay, this guy's a psychopath.
yeah, yeah.
And what I love about this story is, for like 90% of the running time, that's exactly what it appears to be.
Exactly. That's what it seems to be,
Yeah,
right? It's a completely like materialist horror story
yeah,
for about
yeah, yeah,
90% of its runtime.
yeah.
And
Uh,
that would be enough. Given
Oh,
what you've experienced in this, that would be enough.
and to be scrupulously fair to the critics of the day, because we've dinged them a bit already in the last part, talking
Hmm.
about how they kind of missed the point a lot of the time of this book, and I think
Yes.
that that's a fair criticism. But in their defense, holy shit, the blood and guts in this fucking story.
It's really, I mean, throughout the entire thing, there is a incredibly clever thing Barker does with color. So for
Yes.
most of it, it's gray and brown. It's the color
Yep.
of concrete and dirt, and
Yep.
it's urban environments. It's like the color of ash from a cigarette. You know, it's
Yeah.
dirty, it's filthy, and then towards the last fifth of the story, you get blood and
Yeah.
it's red and
Yeah.
it rises from the page, doesn't it? It splashes all over you. It's so vivid.
But think about what we're talking about here. Again, when we describe this story as being cinematic, we're actually talking about a short story that has distinct color palettes.
Right.
I mean, this is fucking storytelling, man. This is
clever.
This is so impressive, and that's part of why it feels cinematic, because you're absolutely, what you've identified there is exactly right. There is a color palette for the first part of the story and a color palette for the last, whatever it is, last third maybe. That once he gets on the train and he falls asleep and he wakes up. That's another thing I love, by the way. So in terms of structure, the first third takes place over maybe a week or so, right? And that's the first, and then the whole rest of the story is almost real time.
Yeah, so there's like this contraction, right
the fuck in to the moment when this poor fucker's world, Kaufman's world is just irrevocably just demolished. And it's just so fucking good, because that feels horror movie to me. That zoom right the fuck in and then just hold. Right, here we go now.
Let's make it immediate. This is where it gets visceral, right? It's where the camera goes behind the eyes, effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And it's claustrophobic. And the atmosphere. I mean, the thing I love is he does this whole thing, and this shouldn't work, but he does it so well. It's when he has Kaufman literally tiptoeing towards the door to peer through, and you're just like, you're sitting there like, don't fucking do it, don't fucking do it, don't fucking do it, don't. You know what you're gonna, and it just. And it's for me, what's great about it is it's one of those few instances, because this is as much of a problem for horror literature as it is for horror cinema. King talks about in this in Dance Macabre. As soon as you open the door and there's a 50-foot monster, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, at least it's not 100-foot. But what's genius about Midnight Meat Train is you fucking know what's on the other side of that door. And so would Kaufman if he was thinking straight.
Yeah, it's the Hitchcockian trick, isn't it?
Yeah, the horror doesn't come from the horror of the unknown. It's the horror of the known.
And again, then he marries it to this incredible banality of communication. So Kaufman hears stuff going on in the next train, and he doesn't really care that much, because it's again, it's kind of what happens, isn't it? There is a line that really struck me this time where he just thinks, is it rape that's happening?
Yeah.
And it's should I go and look? I don't know. Should I bother myself? Should I put myself in danger? And it's only, it's almost like because of curiosity more than anything, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I want to go back just a half step, because there's a moment that is, again, it's cinematic, but it's also brilliantly sinister, and it's where Barker starts the kind of elevator going down in his stomach, and it's such a wonderful moment where he falls asleep, and then he wakes up, and he realizes, and this is so good. He wakes up and he's groggy, but he realizes, no, I haven't slept through any stations. This is the next station, and then he looks around, and he's like, wait, where did the kid go?
Where did the kid go? Right.
And that is so good. It is, because again, Kaufman's thinking on one level, because he's half asleep. He's just woken up. Oh, the kid must have walked through, because Kaufman's, rational, right?
Yeah.
We, the reader, we know he's in a fucking Clive Barker story. So we are screaming at him like, this is your cue. Fucking pull the emergency cord. Get the fuck off this tube train. It's so good. It's so good.
And the setting, of course, on the tube train is in and of itself is brilliant.
Yes.
I mean, because it's an enclosed environment. Everybody is it's already pressurized, right? It's already usually you've got humanity crammed together. It's a boiler. It's a boiling pot, right? You're just waiting for it to boil over. Here again, you've got that wonderful isolation going on.
Yeah, well, that's the genius of it. It's a space that's normally full and now it's empty, and that makes it more sinister.
It makes it resonant, doesn't it? It's like, oof.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of being in an empty subway carriage in New York is inherently scary, right? It just is. I mean, in the real world, I would be nervous doing that.
Yeah, I would prefer someone else to be on
Yeah,
carriage, quite frankly.
yeah.
Yes.
I would not want to be traveling solo in a carriage in a New York. So I just wouldn't. I mean, I'd be all right, but you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't enjoy it. And,
Mhm.
so, you know, it's inherently a kind of tense setting. And then, you know, when you add in the layers of what the way Barker's prepared the ground with the
Yeah.
storytelling, and also like we know, you know, we know that the police think they've got their man and they haven't, right?
Yeah. So they're not looking, right?
No, but
It's
also with the way Barker expresses that, he tells us that these two characters are now on a collision course.
yeah.
He actually expresses that in the prose. So there's no, again, this is a fascinating study of like the difference between, you know, the tension that the fear of the unknown, and the
Mhm.
tension that comes from actually from the audience having more knowledge than the character.
Yeah.
And
And
this
it's
is the,
brilliantly
oh,
pitched,
it's
isn't it?
so good.
Like
So good.
it's a very difficult thing to do when you have the reveal. And
Yeah.
like you were saying, you know, it's often what kills the moment, right? When you
Yep.
have the reveal of what's actually behind the door or the curtain or whatever, it's what kills the moment.
Yeah.
And the reaction is very difficult to get right.
Yeah.
But
But
here it's perfect. It's so human. He just goes for visceral, doesn't he? Like
yeah.
Kaufman basically vomits, and then he can't take it in. He faints. It's gone.
Yeah.
It's done.
No, the faint's great, and it's particularly great because you have that line afterwards where it's like, you know, you don't know how long you've been out. I mean, that's a horror in and of itself, right? Waking up and having no idea how long you've been out for,
Yeah, or where you are,
especially.
because this
Is it
train's been
right? Right,
moving, right?
right. Yeah, and then the memory of what's just happened comes flooding back. And it's like, holy shit. But the other thing I love about it is, for me, it's. I mean, don't get me wrong. Barker delivers on the description. It's one of the most vivid
Oh,
passages of horror,
I've
you know, description I can
in
immediately
terms
recall.
of describing butchery, like
Yeah,
human butchery. He
yeah,
doesn't do, again, he's not doing that trick of like drawing the eye away from the violence or implying
no,
the violence. It's like, no, this is what's happening. I'm going to describe the cuts, I'm going to
yeah,
describe the instruments that are being used and the effects upon the body. You're
yeah,
going to see it.
yeah. But it's brilliant because I'm neither going to rush through nor am I going to linger. I mean, the pacing is actually exquisite.
It
It
is
is, you know what it
exquisite.
is? It's like a slow panning shot
Yeah.
through the
Yeah.
through the thing, and it just takes you through it. Except it's better because it's prose, so you get smell and you get,
Yeah.
you know, but that's what
Texture.
it texture, but
Mm.
it feels like, you know, it has the feel of that. It has the feel of the moment. And you know, like a smart bit of horror cinema, when it's a really horrific scene, they actually cut the soundtrack, right? It's literally
Mhm.
just that you, and you can, I mean, it's not in the prose, I don't think, but for me, like I can hear the roaring of the roar of the
Yeah.
train
Oh yeah, the
as I'm
silence as
panning
you've
through
got
these bodies, you know, and it's
yeah,
just like,
the lack of
oh fucking
music.
hell.
You can feel you can hear like the thuds of the bodies as they're
Yep.
dangling and
Yeah.
the packing sound of the actual blows as
Yep.
mahogany is cutting and whatnot. Yeah, absolutely. It
No,
recalls
it's
the abattoir, doesn't it? You know, it's designed to recall the abattoir.
yeah.
Um, and it is so vivid. The
Yeah.
imagery is so stark and hellish, and yet at the same time there is a banality to it, isn't there? A
Yep.
deliberate banality to it. Like the way Mahogany goes about his business, and he describes this in the prose, is not frenzied. It's not even religious, although you might
No.
expect that given the wider context of the story. It's business. It's workmanlike.
Yeah, no, absolutely, but I also like how, for me, it's all of those things, but it's also how it then, because I don't know about you, but like the moment that happens, it's almost like this is really, 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 really basic horror storytelling, kind of
Yeah.
almost 101. But like, as soon as Kaufman sees that environment and sees the butcher, there's a part of me as the reader that's immediately going like, okay, he's gonna have to go in there.
Yeah.
You know, there's no way and like he's gonna end up walking through, like he's
Mhm.
gonna, and it's just, again, it's what's clever, what I found so exciting, so thrilling about this was like it completely, so much I think of modern storytelling, and I don't know how much of this has got to do with perhaps the way that episodic television in particular works,
Mhm.
but so, and I love a good twist as much as anyone, but I think there's this thing about like it's almost become a fetish about withholding information from your audience.
Yes, yes, definitely. So you
You
can
know?
reveal a twist later,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think
Um,
one of the things I'm getting, this isn't the only place I'm getting it. I'm engaging with a lot of pulp fiction at the moment for
mhm.
various reasons, and I'm seeing it as a thing, but Barker is an absolute fucking exemplar of the form. I love how Barker, especially in the story, just says, fuck that.
Yeah, I'm not going to like whatever twists he's going to introduce are going to be way more profound than that. You're not going
This
to
is
see them
it.
coming, right?
Well, what's brilliant about it as well is part of the reason that the actual twist in this story does land is because I didn't fucking see it coming
Well, how
at
could
all.
you? I mean,
Because
how could you? I mean,
my entire attention is taken up by the fucking contents of that carriage.
yeah, right.
You know,
You,
just like
this is the denouement. I mean, in any other horror story, this has
right.
got to be the denouement, right? This has got to be it. There can't be any more extreme or bizarre images than this. Oh well,
Well,
you know,
I mean, the confrontation, right? That's the bit, like the
yeah.
fight, the physical confrontation between Mahogany and our
And
guy, like
Kaufman,
and
yeah,
Kaufman. That's the logical endpoint, and that feels like a horror movie as well. I mean, in the
yep.
best possible way. It feels like a really fucking good horror movie. You know, feels better than most horror movies. But that confrontation, that's wonderful, and that's where you're just like, yeah,
It
okay,
is fabulous. I mean,
let's fucking do it. You know,
just before that, of course, you've got that wonderful moment where Mahogany has the conversation with the driver.
I love that. Oh, I
I
love that so much.
that's where the story turns for me. That's where
Yeah,
you realize
yeah,
that, you know what, the conspiratorial talk, yeah, there is
right.
something wider going on here. There's either like multiple people involved in this enterprise, whatever the hell it is, who know what's going on. Again, it's that wonderful juxtaposition of the extreme things that are happening and the banality of the conversation,
Yeah.
where it's
Well,
just like it's a work conversation, it's a water cooler
Well,
conversation, right?
that's it, isn't it? That's the beauty of it, and it's two, you know, and these are two, you know, fundamentally, you know, working class occupations, right?
Yeah.
Train driver and butcher,
And
and
Butcher,
those
yeah,
are pretty, you
abattoir
know,
worker.
these are not middle class pursuits particularly. Um, and it's fascinating, yeah. And you're right. Again, as soon as you hear, and actually, and again, how brilliant is this? The banality of the conversation is part of why it's so fucking sinister
Yeah,
because
yeah,
that tells you it's like, oh shit, these guys do this all the time.
yeah. And
This is
there's
just
a
this is a routine. This is
it's harping back to this notion of like systematized
yeah,
violence or
yeah,
systematized
yeah.
atrocity, where
That's right.
there are systems in play that either allow for or require
You know what
atrocity.
you know what it reminds me of? It's one of the it's an absolutely brilliant gag from Terry Pratchett's Small Gods. And it's one that I carry with me because it's one of those that's funny, but it's also actually genuinely kind of horrific and profound.
Mhm.
So Small Gods is, I mean, it might be his best Discord. It's certainly one where he gets really engaged with philosophy and religion, and he really goes.
Yeah, it's a stunner, that book.
It's wonderful, but there's one of the things that has is that the religious group that is running the country in Small Gods is a fairly powerful inquisition, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're going to be a theocracy, you kind of have to torture people to death quite often. It's
Mhm.
just otherwise people might start getting doubts. And it's a class. I think it's actually a Pratchett footnote. You know, because he was very famous for those footnotes. And I think the footnote is something like, and in the coffee room at this, you know, in the tea room at the side of the torture chambers, there were a row of mugs hanging by their handles with the imprint on them, "World's Best Dad."
Yeah,
You know,
right.
and it's just
Yeah.
like, yep,
It harks back to like, I mean, I'm sure I must have spoken to you about this on podcast before, but I've got a book which is it's called Letters from Auschwitz, and what it is it's reproductions of letters sent home from the German soldiers
the
at
guards
Auschwitz,
and
the guards, the
yeah,
workers, and whatnot.
sure,
And the really striking thing about them is how banal they are,
yeah.
right? They have no conception of how horrific what they're doing actually is. They talk about the most banal things. You know, they write home saying things like, "Oh, how is little Hans's piano lessons coming? Oh, I'm so sorry, the dog is sick. Please keep me updated. You would have been so proud of the men. We had another train come in the other day, and they worked so hard getting everything sorted." They talk like that,
Right.
whilst engaged in arguably one of the greatest human atrocities ever committed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, this is it. And it is that kind of, I mean, you know, the phrase banality of evil is overplayed, but there's something to it. And
Oh my
and
God, yeah. Oh
and
my
I
God, isn't there?
and I think as well there's something about just people's And I think this is, this is kind of the wider point that Barker's making. It's just that, the capacity towards a kind of numbness in a city environment. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that we talked about, a while ago now when we were, in What the Hell is Wrong with Us, we talked about Dark Knight Returns. And one of the things that I mentioned in that is there's images of homeless people that Frank Miller pulled directly from his own experience of living in
Well,
New York, actually
yeah.
around this period in the kind of early to mid 80s.
I believe it was around this period that the Kitty Genovese thing came about as well,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
yeah,
The
yeah.
situation with Kitty Genovese. She was a woman who was it was widely publicized. Just I believe it was in an American city, wasn't it? She was assaulted very publicly on a packed street,
Yeah,
like violently, aggressively assaulted, and her assailant went away for a brief period and then came back and
yeah.
assaulted her again in front of numerous people, and people did nothing.
I mean,
Didn't
this is.
intervene, didn't speak up, didn't attempt to stop it,
I mean,
just got
this
on with
is.
their business, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the era when, famously kind of urban self-defense training for women was like, if you're being assaulted, yell fire.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
yell rape because no one will
No,
care. You
because
got
no
to
one
yell
will come,
fire.
but yell
Then they'll.
fire and people will
Yeah.
come.
And it speaks to, and again, Frank Miller and the images of the homeless is like, there's a thing about like, if you lived and worked in New York as Kaufman did, like the kind of, you would literally, not metaphorically, you would literally step over people every
Yeah.
single day to
Yeah.
get to where you were going. And after a while, you stop seeing the people you step over, and that's that whole thing about alienation from even though you're surrounded by humanity, you become
Yeah.
alienated from it, you become isolated from it, and you're, as you say, like you're inured to the everyday brutality that you're
Yeah.
seeing around you.
You see that, don't you? If you don't live in
Yeah.
urban environments and then you visit them, like I don't live in cities and I hate cities with an absolute passion. I loathe almost every city I've ever been to, quite frankly.
Yeah.
In terms of their culture, like their human culture, I find to be abhorrent for the most part. But if you go to places like London in particular, you find that it's stark, the degree to which
Yeah.
people are funneled through their own little tunnels and they don't see you.
I
They
mean,
just don't see you or
I
anyone else, you
I
know?
remember moving to London from the set. I grew up in the West Country, and I
Mm.
moved to London. And by the way, there are plenty of horror stories I could tell you about living in the West Country.
Oh
I'm not sure
yeah,
that.
don't get me wrong. This is
Uh,
not a small, a sort of rural versus urban
no.
argument. There are entirely other horrors that go
Yeah,
on in
yeah,
rural
exactly.
environments, you know?
Small town Devon is not a panacea. Let me tell you that. But
Oh my God, I live in Tamworth. I know exactly.
right.
Oh, the towny mindset. Bloody hell.
Oh man,
Bloody
yeah, yeah,
hell.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But
Unbelievable.
one of the habits I had to unlearn very quickly when I got to London was just the everyday thing of making eye contact with people and
Yeah.
smiling in the street. Like that was something that you would just do.
Yeah.
And then you get to London and it's like you fucking don't.
You don't.
You
No,
really
you
do not
really do
do that.
not.
'Cause if you do, you're a mark. Do you know what I mean? Like seriously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you are exposing your naivete, right?
Yeah. And New York's definitely got that culture
Yeah.
thing.
Oh my
you
God.
know, especially in this era. So yeah, it's that moment when they talk to each other in those banal terms, and you realize like this whole thing is not. This is not, because up to then it's like it's a lone nut killer, and now
Yeah,
suddenly, as you
it's
say,
not.
it's two things. One, it's a conspiracy by definition because you got two
Hmm.
people involved. But then, secondly, as you say, your mind starts going back over that crazy shit that you dismissed of like, oh, he's
And
really
over
delusional. You're like,
Mahogany's delusions as
exactly,
well, and you're sort
specifically
of
that, and
like,
you're like,
"Hmm." I mean, the irony of Mahogany is that he's simultaneously right and wrong.
yeah,
So yeah, he is a functionary within this wider conspiracy. That's absolutely true. And yeah, he fulfills a sacred purpose. That is also absolutely true.
yeah,
But he's also a bit of grit, as is
yeah,
evident, right?
yeah,
He is nothing but not even a cog. He is the tiniest bit of grit in this machine, right?
yeah.
That maybe facilitates the turning of one of the wheels. That's about it. And he's old, he's failing, and when he's dispatched, and it's without ceremony. It's there's no great reward for Mahogany or for anyone who's performed this function. They just become meat like everyone else.
I tell you what I find really fascinating about it though as well is that you get this in the final paragraphs and the final page. The strong implication with Mahogany as it ends up being for Kaufman is, and this is a real mind bender. He ultimately he does it because he's been asked to do it.
Because he's been asked to do it, right? And what Kaufman finds, I imagine, is what Mahogany found when he
Yeah,
sees the father, when he sees the father
yeah,
of fathers. He sees something he's been seeking from the very beginning, which is a sense of purpose, a
yeah,
sense of place, a sense of
yep,
identity. What
yeah,
the story's commenting on is when you operate in environments that ostensibly give you nothing, when you don't have any purpose or place or poetry or any connection to humanity, you'll bow before anything. It doesn't matter how foul the god is or how
yeah,
grotesque what it demands of you are. If there's poetry in it and if it provides you with some sense of purpose, you're going to be on your knees. You are going to do it, right?
yeah.
There's a much wider commentary here that has a lot of application now for things like radicalization on the internet of young men and whatnot. It has profound application in those circles now because that's exactly the phenomena you're seeing.
I mean, I think that's right, but I would argue that I mean that is true and that is correct and that is a one of the things the story does. I would argue though that for me, the real bleakness that Barker is gesturing at here is the radicalizing effect of capitalism.
Yes, very much so.
And I think that is really fucking, I mean, that's actually incendiary. That's
Yeah.
really like, that's playing with fire.
Oh,
And
it
I,
is. I mean, I don't think I think he's unambiguous about this. He is.
yeah,
He is painting a portrait of capitalist society that is entirely cannibalistic. Like it's not even
yeah,
like it's not even it's not veiled, right?
no,
The metaphor is like so close to the surface. He makes it absolutely overt. He's literally saying that like it is a cannibal system,
yeah,
and it breeds. It not only allows for daylight atrocities, which we just allow for and we
yeah.
just accept. There's also lots of underlying atrocities that are parts of greasing the system.
Because the implication by the end of the story is very much that the unsolved murders that have happened and the discovery of the bodies that have been in the press is very much an accident, and it's a sign of
Yeah.
Mahogany's aging. Actually, he's been doing this
Yes.
for years without any detection, because
Yeah.
if he's doing his job right, the bodies just vanish.
That's right. He's getting sloppy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He's
And
getting it wrong. So he's becoming a liability. So he's probably going to be retired before very long anyway.
but yeah, I mean, right, but also what it means is like, the normal functioning is this city just fucking eats people
Yeah.
and nobody knows about it.
Exactly that. It literally eats. And there's also a
Ah,
generational commentary as well,
yeah,
because of
yeah, yeah,
course
yeah.
the cannibals in the underground, they are the they're the actual original creators of the
Right,
city, right?
right, right.
And
And
they're
that's
preying on
interesting.
the younger generation. So
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because the other thing that this story reminded me of thematically, especially with the Father of Fathers, it will not surprise you at all to learn is it,
right, of
right?
course.
Because
Of
it's
course.
the creature on now it's the city rather than the town,
Hmm.
but it doesn't have the same fascination with child flesh, but there's
Hmm.
still fundamentally it's a cannibalistic force
Yeah.
that lives under the sea, and it is heavily implied, although not kind of stated in either story, but certainly in well, it's sort of implied more heavily in it than in Meat Train maybe, but like it's kind of this is kind of what keeps the city going
Yeah,
somehow,
this
like
is like the soul of the city, right?
yeah,
It's the
exactly,
black tainted soul of the city. Without this entity, if these things weren't fed and
yeah,
fed on for whatever reason, it's almost ritualistic, isn't it? I mean, one of them even says we don't have any appetite for this. But we do it because we've got to. It's what we do to survive.
yeah,
Um, Without that ritual and without that feeding, the city itself would collapse.
yeah,
And I mean, what Barker almost implies is, well, wouldn't that be better?
yeah.
Is that so terrible given what it allows and what it hosts and the diseased nature of it anyway?
Well, and also, yeah, exactly. Like, what's so fucking great about the city that you want to
Exactly.
perpetuate it? And I think that's right. I mean, and again, if you do read those creatures ultimately as a metaphor for the vampirism and cannibalism of capitalism itself,
Hmm.
which I think you could, because if they're business, if they're business leaders, if they're the founding,
Yeah.
founders of business, that kind of, then Yeah, right. So that's kind of, yeah,
They're the
capitalism.
empire builders, right? They
Yeah.
state that they are the empire builders. They're the creators of cities and nations, right?
Oh, and what
And
is, what is empire if not an engine for atrocity? I mean, that
exactly right. It's an
by
engine for
design.
atrocity that is slicked by the blood of the young, right? That
Yeah.
is just the nature of it. The bodies of the young are ground between the wheels of empire and capitalism. That's just the nature of it,
Yeah.
right? And the way he paints these creatures is stark as well. I mean, they are withered, diseased, syphilitic. He
Yeah.
uses the term syphilitic, it's
Well,
quite
they're
incredible.
wretched, aren't they? I
Yeah,
mean, they are
utterly
wretched.
wretched.
And weirdly, that's the thing, is that they feel that like they should be vulnerable, and yet something about their presence just completely disarms
Well, it
Kaufman, right?
pacifies, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
there's the really violent turn where the one rips his tongue out. It
Yeah.
says
Yeah.
serve in silence. You don't get to tell these
Yeah.
secrets, right? And
Yeah.
it's intimate. It's horribly intimate because the way it holds his face and it just gently puts its fingers into his mouth and then rips his tongue out. There's
Yeah.
a horrible intimacy to it. It's like ugh,
Well, and then let's not forget, eats his tongue.
eats his tongue. Yeah, that's another thing, right? So it's devouring his voice. I mean,
Oh
yeah.
man, so good,
And then
so
you get
good.
that the bit I always forget for some reason is the very end when he's taken back to the surface by the driver, and there's loads of other people involved, like they're sluicing down the train for tomorrow,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think the driver introduces him. Oh, by the way, this is Kaufman. This is the new guy, right?
Well, it's that pristine station that he's never seen before that they pull
Right.
into, right? And yeah, exactly. Again, you're part of something bigger. This is almost, it's not quite industrial, but it's getting there.
It's not.
It's operating at scale.
Yeah, it's not a
Yeah,
million miles away, is it?
yeah,
It is an industrial human abattoir, right?
yeah,
Quite incredible. And the way the language that's used is that of someone who's just got a new job, right? It's like, this is the new guy who's going to be doing this for us. He's going to be working with us. Say hello to everyone. It's like there's a bonhomie to it, and there's a banality to it, which is something that's consistent throughout the entire story.
yeah. No, that's it exactly. And yeah, it's just an incredibly impressive. You can see why it lodges in people's minds, right?
Oh yeah. Oh,
Um,
a million times over. I mean, even without that revelation at the end, the metaphysics and the weirdness of the Father of Fathers, because
mm,
with the Father of Fathers, you start to see just a little of what will flower later in Barker's fantasy stuff.
right. Yeah, yeah,
The
absolutely.
demigods. I mean,
Yeah,
there's more than a little element of the Jaff in this thing, right?
sure. Yeah, no, I think that's
Um,
right.
but even without that, this would have been one of the most impressive horror stories. If it had stopped with like cat with Mahogany's death, it would have been one of the most impressive horror short stories ever. And then it takes it to another level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? I think I even understand why for so many people it's likely that it's the visceral horror that lodges in the mind because it's
Yeah.
so brilliantly rendered and because
Hmm.
it's so, as we said, so cinematic. I
It's
mean,
shocking.
we haven't talked about it, of course, but the other moment that's pure cinema, pure theater, and a pure moment of wonderful kind of existential horror is the inevitable moment when he gets halfway through the carriage and the fucking lights go out.
Of course. Right, yeah.
Like, and you just like, I actually like, because I'm a horror fan, right?
Uh,
I cackled
yeah.
out loud at that.
Yeah.
I was just like, you bastard, Clive,
Yeah. I mean,
you absolute fucking monster.
watch
So good.
any. I mean, it's a strange thing to say because it's rather niche, but it does happen. Watch any horror movie with a sequence on a subway train,
Oh,
and that happens. Like
not
that.
even horror movies. Like it happens in revenge movie. I mean, we talked
Yeah.
about like there's a Jodie Foster revenge movie called The Brave One, which has an amazing sequence on the subway. There's a subway scene in Joker. There's flickering
Right.
lights are a
Of
massive part
course.
of that scene. Like this, it's iconic.
You
It's
know,
yeah.
going back to yesterday's conversation, I'm thinking of an iconic. A fairly decent sequence from Predator 2, where the Predator is
Yeah,
on subway train, and
yeah,
it's actually pretty good.
yeah. No, this is it, right? And it's just, what I loved about that moment for me reading it was as soon as the lights went out, again, it's that simultaneous shock but also that feeling of like, oh, fucking
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
of course.
yeah.
And
And
then of
because
course he stumbles, and of course and that's
that's
again
it.
where you move beyond cinema, because
Yeah.
cinema can't do anything when the lights go out, but we get the physical description of his hand
Yes.
plunging into one
Something
of
on the
these
floor.
hanging cords, and it's
Yeah.
just like, oh,
Bah.
fuck off, man.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? He loves the visceral, Barker does. He loves sensuality, and he does that thing that Billy Martin will do a little later, where the sensual is the sensual, and he doesn't really draw distinction. So if there's like food, or if there's sex, or if there's violence, it's going to be described with the same lurid, luscious prose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in this one, there's a moment, I think it's quite sly actually, during the physical confrontation where the guy, Mahogany swings at Kaufman and misses, and the cleaver goes into the thigh. And he describes, as he pulls it out, he says, the flesh looks like a really tender steak.
Yeah, that there
You
is. I mean, there's a sense of humor here
know,
too, isn't there?
yeah,
There's that
yeah,
sardonism just running underneath. It's just enough, just like in the previous story, just enough to lend seasoning,
yeah.
and that's it. And it's not funny, but it is wry.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. But also I think, look, I think I think he knows that a horror connoisseur's response to the lights going out is going to be to laugh too, right?
Yeah,
I
of
think he
course.
knows like he's operating on different levels for different readers. And I
Yeah,
think, I mean, one of the things that this is kind of reminding me of, as much as, I mean, this sounds like a very strange thing to say about the man who wrote Books of Blood. One of the things this as a whole is making me realize is it's kind of a mistake to pigeonhole Barker as a horror writer. He's a writer who can write in any genre he wants to, and
hmm
he leans towards the fantastic, and sometimes that incorporates horror elements.
hmm
But it's a mistake to think of him as a horror writer, I think.
Yes, in the sort of codified way that
Yeah,
most people would understand what that means. That is definitely true. I mean, I
but
think if you describe Barker as a horror writer and people pick him up on that basis, they will be very, very surprised.
yeah, and but I also think that certainly this short story, it feels in part like a love letter to
Yeah.
horror. It
Oh,
really, really does.
I think this is like a part of what makes this story is that it's a lot of what Barker loves about horror, certainly cinematically. I think that's where he's drawing from for this one, definitely.
Yeah.
And he's just throwing it at you. He is literally throwing it in the audience's face, in the reader's face. Have you seen the film adaptation
No,
of this?
no.
It's really, it just doesn't work. It just does not work. It makes the mistake of, you were talking earlier about how it would work really well as like an hour long, maybe sort of
Yeah,
episodic
I think
thing.
even half hour. I think you
Yeah,
could do an amazing half hour with
yeah.
this. Yeah.
It does that. It makes the mistake of trying to elongate and elaborate the story. And that saps it of energy. It completely saps it of energy. The
Yeah.
worst thing it does is the scene that's the biggest gift to any visual media creator, which is the subway scene. It turns into a complete hash because it tries to over stylize it, it elongates it, it
Right.
elaborates it.
Yeah.
There's the use of like slow motion and CG blood, and there's no texture, there's no dynamism to it. It just doesn't work.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
sadly, it's a sad thing because certain things about it are good. The casting is good. And Vinnie
Right.
Jones plays Kaufman,
Oh
and
wow.
it's good. I know Vinnie
That's
Jones
amazing.
plays
Oh,
Mahogany,
okay.
and
Yeah, well
it's
that could
good.
work. Yeah.
It's good. He works really, really well as Mahogany,
Huh. Yeah.
but he's in a bad film. And
Right.
good casting does not a good film make, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's a real shame because,
Yeah.
as you were saying earlier, this is a gift.
Yeah.
This is an absolute gift of a story for a filmmaker. And you know what? I think in the right hands, it could make a decent film-sized piece of work. You know,
Yeah,
it
maybe.
doesn't necessarily have to be as contracted as the short story itself. It could work with a little bit of elaboration, a little bit of elongation, as long as it's not undermining the essential soul of the work. And that's
Mhm.
sadly what you get in the film.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
It gives Kaufman way too much to do. It gives Kaufman way too much like backstory
Sure.
and like too much of a life. Ironically, it just gives him too much of a life, which saps the essential themes of isolation.
But also, look, I mean, as much as we have, as much as we've kind of praised at some length kind of the metaphysics of the last half a dozen pages, and I don't want to undercut that now. I think I agree with everything we've said about that. But
Mhm.
I think part of the genius of this is the central image of the train itself and the guy moving through it is so it's so visceral and so brilliantly compelling.
Mhm.
And the reason that for me, part of the genius is Barker realizing, like, I mean, I guess to use that metaphor, right, he goes straight to he carves off all the fat.
Yep.
And this story is nothing but meat. It
Yeah,
really
yeah,
isn't.
it really is, right?
you know
It's so lean, isn't it? It's
yeah,
so
exactly.
lean.
Exactly.
And that's something that exemplifies the books of blood in general. They are
uh,
very refined stories.
yeah.
Nothing feels redundant. But
Yeah.
in this one, you've got a case of like form echoing theme and subject, which is
Yep.
really cool, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think it's just so fucking smart.
Oh, it's a
So
stunner. I mean, like,
yeah.
just like, outside of any wider considerations, it's just a brilliant read. I sat and read the whole thing alongside the Book of Blood and the Attering and Jack. I sat
Mm,
and read those three stories this afternoon, and it feels like nothing. You just breeze through. It
yeah.
carries you through.
Yeah.
It's a stunner. It's an absolute stunner of a short
That's a beauty.
story.
And
It's a
again,
masterclass, isn't it? It's a masterclass.
oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what I love about it. It's a masterclass and a love letter. And I think again, it's that thing of, like, it's fascinating to analyze the structure and realize that all of the tension comes not from not from a parceling out of information, but
No.
from giving the reader everything up front.
Right,
I
right.
just that's really stuck with me as a kind of writing lesson, I think, as a kind of
Yes,
challenge
because
almost.
it's a very difficult thing to do because like you feel as a writer often if you do that you're saying too much, right? That you're
Yeah.
giving the reader too much, when in actual fact that is not the case. As a reading exercise, that will often work really, really well.
Yeah, but it's just for me, it's about recognizing that you can wring as much, if not more, tension from the audience knowing more than the protagonist as you
Hmm.
can from the audience being as clueless as the protagonist. Like,
Yeah.
it's another way of looking at story. It's another way of looking
Yeah.
at tension within story. And I like it. I'm interested in that. So
I
I'm
mean,
gonna let that.
ironically, in this story, it sort of brings the reader in on the conspiracy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It makes
yeah,
you part of it, right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly by the end.
Bloody hell, yes, by the end.
Yeah,
My God. My God. Yeah, and it's the levels it operates on as well. I mean, you would expect if you heard, oh, there's this Clive Barker story called The Midnight Meat Train, you'd immediately think from the title, oh, well, it's a splatter work, right? It's a work
right.
of total splatterpunk, which it kind of is. It's almost like an antecedent to splatterpunk in its own
Yeah,
peculiar way.
no,
But it goes so much deeper than that. It
yeah.
goes so much further than that. As if it's a Clive Barker story, it's almost always going to.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And, like, you can tick them off like it's a thriller, it's a serial killer thing, it's splatterpunk, but it's also,
It's a
you know,
social commentary tract.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
a political. There's a political element to it. It's a conspiracy story.
But it's also profoundly weird horror.
Right. It
Again,
goes bizarro at the end, doesn't
yeah,
it? It's like full
absolutely,
on
yeah,
bizarro. It's so weird at the end, so
yeah.
strange, and yet it works. It
No,
doesn't feel
absolutely.
incongruous. It really, really works. In fact, the vault fast going from totally materialist horror to supernatural metaphysical horror is seamless. It works really well.
But I think the secret to that is, and I'd be amazed. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know to the degree to which this happened consciously, and this is just a writer just writing out of his skin. But of course,
Mhm.
you know, this story starts with a description of the city as a personification, as a human form, as a living thing, and of course by the end we discover that underneath it is exactly that.
It's actually true. It's not just like, I mean, Kaufman, that's how Kaufman characterizes his perception and experience of the city, right? And then he realizes, he comes to realize that it's literally true.
Yeah, the story brings it full circle, but it doesn't hit you over the head with it. Kaufman doesn't have a big moment where he says, "Oh, I guess the city
I
was
was right.
you know."
So, no, and yeah,
It
no,
just
it doesn't.
it lets, because he's bright enough to let that just sit with you as the reader, let you just kind of put that together for yourself.
Yeah, it's the confirmation that Kaufman is unwittingly looking for. He's already got it in his head.
Yep.
He's already got it, and then he finds that it's literally true at the end.
Which again just lends the weight to the feeling that maybe there's a fatalism to the whole thing, that there's almost a preordained kind of.
There are wider forces at work here. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not good forces, and they're not even like competent forces.
Oh no.
It's a diseased engine, right? That they're all being fed through. It's completely unhealthy and breaking down, and only just sustaining.
Yeah. No, it's God.
Amazing. I mean, just genuinely amazing. Go forth and read. I mean, yeah, that's just it. Just go forth and read these stories, especially if you are a writer. If you're a writer of horror, my God. I mean,
that's what I'm realizing already. Here we are 2 stories in, and like this is an essential text. There's no getting away from it. If you're a horror writer, this is an essential text.
From the 1980s. I mean, this was originally published the year I was born.
Right, there you go.
It's as old as me.
Yeah.
It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I just can't believe it, and I almost, it's one of those things where I'd love to sit and chat. Obviously, I'd love to sit and chat with Clive, but I would love to be able to tell him, that this short story collection that was published when I was born, is still the masterclass in how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and I love it, and I think about that like a lot of great creative visionaries, in any artistic field. I mean, you mentioned Bowie earlier. I think about, that run of Beatles studio albums. Maybe I think about the Stones 68 to 72. I think about, the Who during their Live at Leeds era, and it's just like there are you get artists and whatever frame they're working, and it's just like they just set a bar. And it just becomes a standard. It becomes it's simultaneously kind of a challenge and something to be celebrated. And and also there's a kind of, for me, there's a kind of acknowledgement, like the idea that a 40-year-old short story collection feel as fresh as this does. Again, there's a challenge there in terms of like, what does that mean about how you approach prose? What is it that Barker's doing that means that it just feels as sparkling and as alive as it did on the day it was printed? That's incredible. That is incredible.
It is. I mean, there's a kind of magic, isn't there?
There is. No, there absolutely is. That's a kind of, because that's the kind of, the energy, and that it feels like that's a kind of, intimation of longevity, right? That it's still got that kind of power to it.
And I can't believe it. Like, even like, I mean, you and I are particularly saturated in this kind of material, right? We immerse ourselves in this kind of material, and the fact that it still distinguishes itself. That's very impressive. That is
head and shoulders.
Impressive.
It's absolutely head and shoulders.
Wow.
Yeah. Well,
the midnight meat tray,
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to Yaron and Jack when we get a chance.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.